So you guys should be here for the FileMaker and Agile session about how to quickly solve business problems. So how many of you guys are here as project managers? Okay, great. How many of you guys are developers? Looks about 50-50. How many in-house developers do we have? Okay, great. So everyone's welcome here today. We're going to be talking about Agile projects within the FileMaker space. And so if you're a project manager, it's going to be a great opportunity for you to understand the aspects that we're talking about for Agile. But if you're a developer, it's always good to take a step back and really understand how a project is set up so that you can be really successful on the team that you're working with. So I think everyone will get something useful out of it today. And I just also wanted to take a pulse of the room of how many of you guys actually understand Agile and work with it before. So how many of you would say you really understand Agile and you know all the ins and outs and you've done a project before? Okay, a few hands. And then how many of you guys have maybe not really heard about Agile and you're excited to learn about it? Awesome. So a lot of you guys. That's awesome. So today, we're really going to be giving you a foundation of what Agile is. So no matter where you're at in your journey of understanding Agile, today we'll make sure everybody has the same definitions so that when we talk about the projects, we're all talking on the same level. But before we get there today, I wanted to give you a background of who I am. So I first used FileMaker at the Disneyland Resort when I was working there. And I was part of the industrial engineering department, and we were using FileMaker for pretty basic data collection. So if you think about Disneyland, there's all sorts of data that they track, like wait times and transaction times. So we were building very simple applications to collect data. We went from taking something from paper and pen to something more complicated in FileMaker. And as we started using FileMaker, we were able to build onto the application and continue to build and build and build, which allowed us to collect all kinds of different information around the resort. So I first started out taking a little bit of data on the Indiana Jones ride, which is really cool. I'm sure some of you, it's your favorite. And then we went into a lot more complicated things like understanding the wait time from the time you park all the way to the time you get into the resort. So I have experience being an in-house developer for the industrial engineering team, and so I'm coming at this presentation from that angle. But since then, I've joined iSolutions and become a project manager. So I also have understanding of a variety of projects and how they are run, whether that's been projects where we've run it as an Agile environment or projects that have run more Waterfall. So I've experienced coming at different projects with different development styles. So I'm coming at this presentation from multiple angles. So hopefully you'll be able to understand that as we go throughout the presentation. And I'll be addressing everyone hopefully throughout this presentation. And then one more thing, if you would like to see a paper that's been written on this, I wrote a more in-depth paper about Agile and FileMaker together, which gave me a lot of the material for today's session, and it's listed on mydevconsession.com, and you can scroll down and find that paper if you want to learn more after this presentation. And with that, I'll also note one more thing, that we're going to be taking a few questions at the end, so I won't stop in the middle for questions, so save them for the end. Okay, so for us to get started, we have to start from the very beginning, and we really need to talk about development styles. And we can't get to Agile until we talk about the other software development styles out there. So there's really two main software development styles, right? There's Agile, which we're here today to talk about, and there's Waterfall. So Waterfall is our more traditional method, and Agile is our newer style that we'll be talking about today. But what I want to do is start with Waterfall, because in order for us to talk about and understand Agile, we have to understand what it is not. And what it is not is Waterfall. So let's start there. So what is Waterfall? So I'm going to go through the definitions and basis so that we have an understanding all together and are talking the same terms. So Waterfall is a sequential module process. It's all about 5 modules of gathering your requirements, building out your design, building out your build, going through testing, and then finally deploying. But it's done in a sequential process where you're filling out and completing one module before you go on to the next module. So you will gather all of your requirements before you go into your design. And similarly, you'll go throughout your entire building process before you go through testing with your client. So you're going in this in a very sequential order, very structured, and very step-by-step. Agile is very opposite of that. It's agile, it's flexible, it's fluid. So you're moving between those same five modules of requirements, design, build, test, and deploy, but you're going through them very fluidly. So you're iterating on them in two ways. The first way that you're iterating is that you're taking a set of full project plans, full project, and bringing it out into modules. And you may be in one module where you are gathering the requirements, doing your design, doing your build, while on another module you might be building, and another module you might be at the first stage of requirements. So you're kind of iterating through those 5 different stages, but in different modules. It's also iterative in the sense that as you break out your project, you're working on a minimum viable product, and you're building that. And then you are adding on the next module, building it, and adding it to the first module. So you're iterating throughout your bigger project and delivering your entire product to your client just like you would in Waterfall, but in smaller chunks. So because Agile is what we're here to talk about today, and it's a little bit newer for some of you, we're going to spend a lot more time talking about Agile. So I'll dive into the principles, but before we get there, we're going to talk about the Agile Manifesto. So again, what is Agile? There is a manifesto about it, and they highlight 4 concepts. The first concept is this idea around focusing on the individuals and interactions. So in your Agile team, you're really focused on who the team members are on your team and what works for them. So you're focused on the individuals. You're not so much focused on the tools and the processes in place. So yes, you'll have processes that you would like to follow, but if they're not working for your team and not working for the individuals that you're working with, you're going to change them, and you're going to iterate on them just like you are on the bigger project. It's also about the working software. So just like Waterfall, we're always trying to deliver working software no matter who it's for. But if you're focused on the working software, you're less focused on all the documentation that you have to do. So in Waterfall, it's very structured around gathering your requirements and having those signed off and having your full plan. In Agile, you're focused on the software, and so the documentation might take a back burner in your development. Next, we're really focused on customer collaboration. So it's all about the relationships that you have on your team and with your customer. What it's not really focused on is contract negotiation and all of those rules and strict guidelines, because if you are focused too much time, again, on the documentation, there may be hindrance to the relationships that you're having with your client. And then finally, it's all about responding to change. There's one thing you should think about is with the word Agile is flexible. It's change, and it's being adaptable to that. If you're unwilling to be responsive to the change that's flying at you, Agile is probably not going to work for you. So what I'd like to do is talk about the principles, because I think the principles will continue to highlight these 4 points. So Agile has 12 principles in total, but I've taken the liberties of bucketing them into 3 groups that I think further highlight where we're going with this. So the first set of principles highlights everything about the software. So at the end of the day, we're trying to deliver software, right? We're trying to deliver working software, just like the waterfall method. But we're delivering it in modules. So we're delivering it frequently, in a constant rhythm, at a constant pace, so that you can deliver one module and then the next module and then the next module in very consistent iterations. Typically, what we'll talk about later on is that you'll deliver something every 2 weeks. So it's a constant every 2-week deliverable. How would you be able to do this and deliver this software? Well, that's where the next set of principles come into play, and it's all about your team. In Agile, it's very focused on who is on your team. So it's very important that your team is self-organized and that everybody is willing to be on that team. If you have any players on your team that aren't really wanting to be there and have been forced to be there, they're probably not going to put in the level of effort and the attitude that's needed to make Agile work. It's also about having the team work together. Again, it's very important that this team can work together to deliver that software. One of the principles of Agile really focuses on the face-to-face communication with your team, and that's probably one of the areas that within our realm that is probably not what we can always deliver. A lot of us probably work remotely, and so we're not able to always have the face-to-face conversations, but luckily there's so many tools out there for us that we can kind of bypass this principle and make Agile work remotely. But in everything, it's all about having a supportive environment. So the project team has to be supportive of the ideas that things are going to be changing and that you will adapt as you go. So with that, the last set of principles is all about attitude. So your team really has to embrace the Agile realm of saying that things are going to be changing. There's always going to be changing requirements, and you have to embrace that. Because you're not spending a lot of time in the very beginning taking all of your requirements and crossing every T and dotting every I and knowing exactly where you're going, there's going to be changes. And if your team is not set up to take on that attitude and be willing to change, and knowing that what we do today might change tomorrow, and they want something more specific and less flexible, we're not really going to work in the realm of Agile. So it's all about your team and all about your attitude. They also have to adjust their behavior very often. So within Agile, within a lot of the techniques, you have sprints, and at the end of every 2-week sprints, or however long your sprints are, you have a retrospective ceremony where you're considering what happened in the last sprint and what went well and what went different, or what needs to change and be different in the next sprint. With that, the attitude should also be addressed. If anything has come up with the team where the team is no longer working together, that needs to be addressed right then and there for the next sprint, or else you're just on a downward spiral where your team is not going to continue functioning well. But at the end of the day, again, the team attitude needs to be all about delivering working software that's excellent and simple, because you're delivering it in modules every sprint. So with that, I hope that we have now a clear understanding of what the Agile principles are, what Agile is, and how it's different from Waterfall. So what you guys are all here for, though, is to consider how Agile actually works with FileMaker. So our question is, can FileMaker be Agile? And I would hope that we don't have to spend too much time on this because we know that it's Agile. But I'm going to explain why in case you guys are still wondering or are a little sleepy and need some more explanation. So, FileMaker. Can FileMaker be Agile? Yes. According to being an Agile platform, we have to be able to change direction and build very quickly. So we know in FileMaker that we have the cohesive layers of data storage, logic, and UI. So if we have to make any change at all, you can quickly make that change, and you only have to do it once. You don't have to make the change in multiple places. So we already know that the FileMaker platform allows us to be Agile in its nature. The next thing is that it has to be quick and flexible. And again, we know that FileMaker is quick and flexible. With the interface of being what you see is what you get, we even have project managers that are able to create layouts, create mock-ups to show the client or whoever you're working with so that you can move around objects, move around your layout, and redefine it if you needed right then and there. So you don't have to do a lot of work to just do that mock-up. And because of that, we know that the platform allows us to be very flexible, very quick, very agile, if you will. One other thing, though, is that according to the principles, is that an Agile platform actually has to have ongoing support. But I would say that just even the people in this room and being at a conference this big, we already know that there's a lot of ongoing support. There's an entire ecosystem here of an online community, people here, and people that are willing to help each other out. So if you're in an Agile project and you hit a road bump and you hit something that you might not know about, and you need somebody to help answer a question, you have a wealth of resources at your fingertips to help you. And that makes it a lot easier for a platform to be Agile. So we know that FileMaker is Agile. So how come we're not always doing Agile projects? Or are you? Is everyone doing Agile projects? I didn't think so. So the question becomes, why is that? And really, the issue is because there are constraints. And there's constraints for any type of project. So it's not that there's constraints on FileMaker. We already know that FileMaker can be Agile. But there's constraints from the project perspective. And that's where we're going to spend a bulk of the time today talking about, is what are the constraints. So the constraints that I'm proposing are resources, scope, time, and budget. And a lot of you here who are project managers might be thinking, I already know this. You're talking about the project management triangle of budget, scope, and time, where I can only have 2 of the 3 to make it work. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about 4 specific constraints for Agile projects and very specifically. So we're going to go through each one of these constraints and talk about it more, talk about questions that'll help you think through how to address these constraints, and I'll throw in some examples as we go. So the first one I want to focus on is resources. So on each one of these constraints, I'm going to show you a continuum, and on the continuum is going to be from one end to the other of what we're talking about, where there may be a constraint on one end or on both ends. So the first constraint here is resources. And with resources, what we're talking about is the resources on your team for an Agile team. So within Agile, teams usually work best when there are 5 to 7 people on your team. And you want subject matter experts, you want developers, and you want a project manager. Anywhere more than that or less than that can hinder how an Agile project works. So we're really talking about who's on your team when we're talking about resources. So when we look at a continuum like this, we're thinking of anywhere on a very small company or project team to a large company or a large project team. And if you're thinking about that size of about 5 to 7 people on your team, we know that a small company might have some constraints. So if you're working with a very small company who's pulled in a lot of directions, they might not be able to have the subject matter experts on your team that are needed to make decisions right away that you have in your sprints. And so you're going to have a constraint there where Agile might not really work for the project you're working on. If you have a very, very large company, you have the opposite problem. You might be forced to have too many decision makers on your team. And then if you're pausing to have 10 or 15 people make a decision about where to go in the direction of your build, you've stopped your entire process and you've now gone into requirements gathering and you're in Waterfall, you're not in Agile. So you have constraints on both sides of the spectrum here. But what we want to do is focus on how can we make our constraints work for us and be Agile. So if you can find somewhere in the middle in these situations where you have a team where you only have the necessary subject matter experts that are needed for your team to drive it forward, that's the win-win. That's your sweet spot of Agile. But you need to make sure that you also have the right people in the team. It's not only just the subject matter experts. You should also probably consider having the person on the team that actually writes the check so that you know that what you're building is actually going to get paid for at the end. One more thing to consider, and I have an example here, is vacation schedules or maternity leave or anything of the sort. Because I've seen projects try to be run Agile. They launch into a sprint and then somebody takes off for vacation or they head to a conference or they go out on maternity or paternity leave. And now you're completely stuck because that was the one decision maker and they are not there. So you've totally stopped and you've halted your Agile process and you have to wait. And so you've probably now stepped back into Waterfall. So to help you along your journey of considering this resource constraint, we have some questions to think about. So think about how small or large your company or department is. Think about how many decision makers there are and whether they need to be in the room. Who's the financial decider? Do they have to be part of the team? Or sorry, do they have time to be part of the team? So is there any of these constraints about vacation schedules or conferences or so on? Or is there anything else that they have on their plate? Are there other projects that they're part of that are taking up so much of their time that they really can't contribute to being part of an Agile team? So now that we've covered resources, we're going to move on and talk about scope. So again, we have a continuum here where we have anything from a structured scope to an evolving project. So when we talk about scope, I'm not talking about exactly what's being built. I'm talking about how much you know about what's being built. Because at this point, before we even are getting into the details, we're just trying to decide what type of project style we're going to have. And so it doesn't really matter at this point what you're building. It matters how much you know about what you're building. So on one end, we have a structured scope. We have a situation where your client, or if you're in-house, you've been given a list of requirements and you know them, and they don't want any changes to them, and they don't want to discuss anything further about any changes to that scope. That's on one end. Your other end is where you have scope that you don't have any definition for, but you might have a general roadmap of where you're going. If you're in the first scenario where you have a very, very structured scope and you've been handed it and it's your requirements, that's already waterfall. You've already gone through your requirements gathering, and so that you've stopped and you're not in an agile environment. If you have an evolving project where you know a roadmap, but you don't know all of the specifics about a project, you're more in the realm of having an agile project be started. The importance here is to understand if you have a roadmap, and also if you think that your customer or whoever you're working with might be changing their requirements. If they start to hint that things may be changing in the future, it might be an opportunity for you to think, maybe I should start to run this as agile because I already know that we're going to need to be flexible and change as we go. So one of the examples I have here is there's a particular client that I've worked with that has wanted to run agile. They've set up a Jira board, and they know that they want to work agile, they know the benefits of working agile, they know they want to deliver often, and they've tried to put in place, sprints and so on and so forth. And they had a general roadmap of where they're going, but within each sprint, you still have to define where you're going. You still have to write out your requirements. And that has to be done very quickly. And they were unwilling to put any of their tasks and any definitions into Jira. So that stopped the process, and we had to spend days, sometimes half the sprint, just to figure out all of the requirements. That is not agile. That is mini waterfall projects all in one. And so you do have to take into consideration when you're going to figure out some of the scope and then iterate on it. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So anytime in any of these factors that we're considering, if you're having to stop, whether it's to get a requirement or to get more funding, etc., you've stopped and become waterfall. So that should be a key takeaway for you. If you're in a project right now and you're not quite understanding why it's not running well in Agile, it's because you're stopping and you're halting the process. So you should consider whether it might be better for you to move into waterfall. So questions that you should consider that we've talked about: how defined is the scope? Are they willing to change the scope? And does it appear that requirements may change often? So consider those questions as we go. The third constraint here is all about time. So when we talk about time, we're talking about how much time it's going to take to build and deliver the solution. So you can have anywhere from a quick deadline to a very long time frame of like a year contract. In this, your constraint is really your quick deadline. If you have something that needs to be delivered fast, it's not to say that Agile won't work. Agile will work because we know it can be iterative. However, usually, if you're working with a client who wants a very, very quick deadline, what they want to know is, can you deliver it on time? And if you're stopping to figure out all of your requirements and how long all of them are going to take, and then delivering in that final project plan, you've moved into waterfall and you're no longer Agile. So if you're an in-house developer, you may not have these types of constraints. Right now you might be pausing and saying, am I in the right session? This might not apply to me. Well, if you are at this point where you don't have these constraints, you're lucky. But also, I don't know if I fully believe you, because you do often have these constraints. Even in the idea of having no deadline ever, you always have some sort of deadline, because we know in Agile that you're delivering in 2-week sprints or whatever your time frame that you've decided. So every 2 weeks, you should have a deliverable. And so you do have some sort of timeline that you are meeting every 2 weeks. So questions to help you on your journey would be, what is the deadline? What is actually needed by the deadline? And this is a very, very important question, because if you've determined that only actually a small piece has to be delivered by the timeline, then you might be able to make this no longer a constraint and work in a modular fashion and iterate on the solution that you're providing. And now you've created an agile situation, right? You are going to deliver just the minimum viable product that needs to be delivered by the timeline specified, and then you have additional time to add on and iterate and add on and be an agile situation. The next question would be, why is there a deadline? And again, that goes with what is actually needed. So the deadline is important too, because your deadline might be set because you're actually the client actually needs to use it at a certain point, but it also might be related to budget. So if your budget is the reason that you have a timeline, that'll come into our next constraint. But you might want to consider, is there ever an opportunity to not make that a constraint and see if there's opportunity for more funding? But we'll get to that constraint next. And then, I addressed that. Is there a timeline for budget? So that will be our next constraint. So budget here. Again, we have a continuum here where we have anywhere from a small budget to a never-ending budget. And when we talk about budget here, it's really about the amount of money that the product is going to cost. It's not really about the time that all of your key players are in the room talking, because that, in a sense, is costly to the client that you're working with. But right now, we're just discussing the budget for what you're building. So again, you can have anywhere from a small budget to a never-ending budget. And really, when we talk about a never-ending budget, it's not that you don't have ever a budget, but it's just that you're going to probably be having to prove out what you're building is going to have a return on investment. But if you do have a small constrained budget, the reason why this becomes a constraint in an agile realm is similar to time. If your customer or client or group that you're working with wants to understand that you will deliver it within the budget and it's a small budget and they want to be very careful about how it's spent, then you're having to stop. You're having to gather all your requirements, figure out all the time for it, give a bid on all of it, and deliver that, and you've moved into Waterfall and no longer Agile. So those are two similar constraints for time and budget. So questions to consider with talking about budget is, what is the budget? How strict is that budget? Is there any leeway? You might get a budget right off the bat, but it might become looser as they find out that they want more bells and whistles added on, and you can continue to add those modules on later. Is the budget constrained by some sort of timeline? So do you have a budget because you have a monthly budget, or do you have a budget because you have the money available in this quarter, but we know you might not have it in the next quarter or the next year, and so you need to address it now? And is there more potential for more budget down the line? Is another question that will help you determine, should you be building a minimum viable product and then considering modules later on down the road? So these are the 4 main constraints that we talked about, and I hope that you have an understanding of where the constraints are on both sides and where Agile really fits in to give the best scenario possible. But there's one more factor that I want to bring up, and that's your relationship with your client, or the relationship with the department that you're working with in-house. So this is a really important factor because it's all about trust. So if you have a new client that you're working with, and especially a client who might not really understand technology and software building and any of that sort, they might never have ever heard of Agile, and it might be difficult to explain that to them what Agile is and that you want to build in that type of environment. With an existing client, you may already have that relationship, and even if you didn't have your first project be Agile, you may have taken advantage of Agile tools and Agile techniques, and so in the next project or in the next module that you're adding on, you're able to set them up for better success in saying, let's run this next one Agile, because they'll already trust you. So that's just another consideration to take in mind when you're figuring out whether your project from the beginning should be run Agile or not. So with that, now that you understand the constraints, I want to make this a little bit more tangible for you guys. So I've come up with 3 examples, and you'll see in the examples that they're not completely detailed out, but I guarantee you that there's enough information in them that you will be able to decide whether you want to run it waterfall or Agile. So let's start with this first example. So let's say that you're working with an existing client, or you're an in-house developer at this company. They're a large entertainment company. They're an extremely busy department, but you have already identified that there's several key players that are willing to give their time and be on your team and give the necessary time that's needed. As far as scope goes, they already have an existing solution, and you're adding on to it. There's no deadline as far as time is concerned, and for budget, they have a pretty decent budget, as long as you can prove that what you're going to build out has a good return on investment. So I'm going to pause, and I'm going to give you a minute or 2 to think about how you would run this. Think about the constraints that are here, and go ahead and talk to your neighbors and figure out how you would address it and maybe how the others would address it. And keep in mind all of those questions that we went through. Those are a good list to go through to think about how you would run this project. Okay, I hear some good conversations. I at least heard words like waterfall and agile, so I think you guys were talking about it. So let me walk through how I would approach this. So I would start thinking about which one of these are constrained, or if they're unconstrained. So for resources, I think we're in an environment where we're unconstrained. Although we're working with a very large company, we identified that there are key players willing to make time. As far as scope goes, I also think we're unconstrained because we're adding on to an existing solution, so we probably think that they have an idea of a roadmap of where to go. We may be wrong on that, but that's the assumption I'm going to take to make this decision. As far as time goes, there's no deadline, so we're unconstrained. There probably is a deadline if we were to keep asking questions, but for the purposes of this, I'm going to say that it's unconstrained. As far as budget goes, we know that there's a decent budget, and we're all fantastic teams, and so of course we're going to be able to prove return on investment, so there's no issues there, and so we're unconstrained. So in my mind, the approach that I would take would be to make it agile. We probably already have a great relationship with the client since they're trusting of us and they want to already give us the next part of adding on to this solution. We can make modules that we add on to the existing solution, and we can do it in 2-week sprints where we are providing our own kind of timeline and our own kind of budget for ourselves. So hopefully that's where you landed. This is probably the easier of the 3 examples we're going to go through. So let's see if there's something a little bit harder. The next example is about an apparel company. So again, all made up, but I'm giving you enough information to go off of. So with the resources, it's a small company, it's a small apparel company. Limited resources, right, because it's small. The scope, as we begin our conversations with this client, we hear them say that they want to start with an iPad solution. As we continue our conversations and are framing up how this project is going to run, we find out that they actually want a full system replacement of multiple applications and multiple processes that they're using in-house. As far as time goes, they want their full system replacement done in 6 months. At this point, you probably don't know what the full system replacement is, but you know full system replacement in 6 months. And as far as the budget goes, it's sizable, but it's not like it's unlimited. So I'll give you a minute or 2 to think about it and discuss with your neighbor how you would approach this. Okay, so it sounds like you're starting to quiet down, so maybe you've talked it through. I'd say this is a little bit harder of an example than the first one, right? We kind of unclear on what might be constraints or unconstraints. So let's talk through it. As far as resources go, it's a small company, right? So it's probably got constrained resources. They're probably pulled in multiple directions because they're just trying to get the company to run. So we're probably constrained there. As far as scope goes, it's a full system replacement, so it might be unconstrained in the sense that there's a lot to it. You could also say that it's constrained though, because you don't know exactly what's going to need to be replaced, and it's quite a large project. But I'll leave it as unconstrained for now. As far as time goes, it seems really quick for a full system replacement that we don't really know what the full system replacement is, and it's 6 months. Sure, we can probably deliver quite a bit in 6 months, but maybe that's a little constrained in our minds of how we'll be able to do that. And as far as budget goes, I'm putting it as constrained because since we don't know what the full system replacement is, we don't really know if it meets their criteria of unlimited, since we don't really know what unlimited is. And I'd probably want to spend more time diving in and understanding what unlimited actually means to this particular client. So what would I do? It's not really straightforward if this can be run Agile or this can be run Waterfall. So I would actually do a hybrid approach, which some of you are like, but that wasn't an option. And I understand that, but that's why we're going to continue talking about Agile and the constraints and how to run FileMaker. So in this type of situation, because it's a full system project and we have a 6-month timeline, what I would do is gather all my requirements in a waterfall-like method. I would sit them down, I would talk to them about all the requirements that they need. I would get full sign-off with them since it is a small company and they probably don't have time to dedicate to being Agile. But then what I would do is in my building process, I would take advantage of all of the Agile techniques and run Agile. And I would break up the bigger project into modules. I would deliver the first minimum viable product, and then I would add on to it and add the next iteration and the next iteration and add on until we're delivered the full system. And hopefully we'll be able to deliver the bulk of what we need in those 6 months and then add on. And it also helps guide the budget as we go with this client. So now I'm going to move into example 3. So we have an engineering company with field technicians. This is an existing client, and they're utilizing a paper process. And their paper process follows kind of what they want to do with the FileMaker application. So they do have a good process, but they want to make it in the technology world and actually use FileMaker and get away from paper processes. So as far as resources go, though, it's a small company, and the owner is having a baby at any given time, and so they might be out. I don't know, that might be something we should consider. So Scope is an iPad solution to help write reports in the field. So we know that much direction at least. And budget, we have a monthly budget of $5,000 a month. So I'll give you guys another minute or two and talk amongst yourselves and figure out how you would approach this. Ready, go. Another thing that you can consider while you're talking it out is if you don't know the answer, you don't know exactly how you would go because you don't have specific questions answered yet, you can continue to think about what questions would you want to be answered to help you derive at your solution. Okay, so let's talk through this. So as far as resources go, we're constrained. It's a small company, they're pulled in a lot of directions, and not only that, the owner is going to have a baby, so we know we're going to lose them very quickly. As far as scope goes, it's unconstrained. We know it's an iPad solution, we know enough to make the next decision. And as far as time goes, it's a 6-month turnaround, so it might be constrained in our minds because it could be considered fairly quick. We don't know. I'm going to make that constrained just for our purposes. And budget, I put semi-constrained because we have a pretty decent budget. We could keep going on and on and on as many months as we need. The constraint here is the amount of money that we have per month. So we're constrained in the sense that we can only deliver so much of the product before we run out of money. So what would we do? I would propose that we do a hybrid approach again. Yay! Sounds like some of you guys went that way. Okay, so this is how I would do it. Again, I would gather up all the requirements up front, get the owner to sign off on them because they need to go off and have a baby and take care of that, and we don't want to be asking them any additional questions. We also know that there's only $5,000 a month, which might be a decent chunk, but I'm going to say only $5,000 a month, and go with the fact that we have to deliver pieces of the full project in a monthly fashion because we're going to be constrained by how many hours we can work a month. And so that's already lending ourselves for the build to be agile, because we're going to build in sprints, so probably 2-week sprints, so we'll have 2 sprints every month, and we already know that the total amount of chunk of work that we can take on is exactly $5,000 worth. So we can separate our project into $5,000 chunks and deliver in monthly fashions until we get the full system rolled out. So, what do? We've been in a presentation about Agile and FileMaker, and we're learning that there's so many project constraints that we can't run Agile. So does that mean that it's hopeless and we can never run anything in Agile? Well, what I hope that we just saw in those examples is that although we have constraints that usually lend ourselves to not have true Agile all the time, that we're able to do a hybrid approach. And that's what we talked about in those last 2 examples. So of course there's a lot of different varieties of hybrid since it is a hybrid, but here's what I'm proposing. That our hybrid approach becomes a waterfall requirements and an agile build. And there's many reasons for that, but the 2 examples kind of highlighted some of these. So I'm going to dive into the waterfall requirements first. So your requirements have to be waterfall for a couple of reasons. Usually, the client that you're working with wants to understand the total cost, and they want to understand the full timeline. If they need to understand to that level of detail, you're already forced into a waterfall environment, and you have to deliver that. And so instead of fighting it and wanting to be agile, let's just give them what they want and make the best relationship with your client and give them the total cost and the total timeline. The other thing is you have to bill at a regular interval, right? So if they want to set up something where they know exactly how much they're going to get billed at on the regular intervals, you're probably going to need to determine that from the beginning, and so your requirements will end up becoming more waterfall than agile. If you're an in-house developer and this might not be quite constrained for you as far as your requirements go, that's okay. But at some point, you're probably going to have to deliver some sort of timeline. And I just want you to remember that any time that you're stopping to deliver any type of documentation like that, you've moved into waterfall. So you may be thinking that you're agile, but you probably have some aspects of your project that you've already become waterfall and not agile. So what we want to do, though, is take full advantage of building in agile, because there's a lot of benefits to agile, like we've shown. So what we want to do is break the bigger project into smaller modules. We want to take our big roadmap, we want to take all of the requirements that we've gathered, all of the details, and break them into chunks. The first chunks should really all be about your minimum viable product, so that you deliver something very quickly to the client that they can use. There's a lot of advantages to this, right? Because if you deliver a working software that they already like, they already feel like they have what they wanted to get, you're already building the trust with them, and then you can continue to add on. It also helps with testing purposes to only have modules being given to the client at one time. So the other benefit is also that you have some change control with this as well. So any additional scope creep that comes up with your project, because we all know that there's scope creep, whether you're dealing with a client or you're in-house, there's always additional requirements that somebody wants. There's always additional functionalities that pop up. This allows you to push them into later modules, because you already have your roadmap, you already have your requirements, and you already have what you've decided and agreed upon with whoever you're working with. But as you're building and as you're being agile in your iterations, you just take any additional requirements and move them into a later module that you're going to iterate on later. This also helps with change control. So while the Agile principle is that you take less time on your documentation, it is important, especially as a client, that you're handling change control very well and you're making change orders as needed. So you can take anything that's in additional modules and make those part of your change orders. The other thing with Agile is how do we make this work for us in the best optimal way. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. So within Agile, it's typical that you'll run 2-week sprints, and you'll scope out the amount of work that you're going to tackle in those 2 weeks. Everybody agrees to that, and at the end, you're able to deliver your module to the client fully tested so that they can have it and then they can test it. You can change, your frequency, but typically what works best is 2 weeks. You test at the end of each sprint, and you often have daily calls, and that's why resources are important to an Agile build. So if you don't have the right resources that are willing to make time for your project, you might get away with it in this type of hybrid approach because you've already gathered all of those requirements and gotten them signed off during the Waterfall Requirements gathering. So your questions about what you need from the client might be different, and you might not necessarily have to have them in every single daily call. But as far as development goes, you will probably have your development team working in daily calls. At the very end of your 2-week sprints, we talked about this earlier, you'll have retrospective ceremonies where you review how the last sprint went. You'll talk about what went well, what needs to change for the next sprint, and this is really good to take advantage of no matter what type of project style that you're doing, because you should be changing. You should be iterating on how your team is working and making sure that you're building a very strong relationship among your developers and among your client and whoever else is on the team as subject matter experts. And then finally, your ongoing support on that project should be run Agile. Now that you have the relationship with the client, you no longer have a constraint on your relationship. You no longer have to explain to them the benefits of Agile because you've already shown them. And so if you've already on your first project had a requirements gathering that's been Waterfall, and then you've built in Agile, you can probably continue your ongoing support as Agile as well. So what you'll need to do is determine their long-term plan and break it into smaller modules. And as long as you know the end goal that they're going towards, you can run more Agile approach where you're iterating and delivering these modules. And you're going to deliver at this steady pace very constantly. So, in conclusion, what I hope that we've covered and what I hope that you've understood today is multiple things. First, that there's waterfall and agile development styles, and they are very different. We also know that FileMaker embraces the agile methodology. We know that it's an agile platform, and so we can work with it in an agile environment. We also know that not every FileMaker project can be agile. We spent a lot of time talking about the constraints to consider, like resources, time, scope, and budget. However, we also know that there's so many benefits to running Agile that we want to take advantage of Agile. So what we should do is use a hybrid approach. And our hybrid approach becomes using a waterfall methodology for gathering your requirements, and then in your build and on ongoing support, run Agile as you can. Of course, there are other opportunities for you to run different versions of hybrid approaches, but that's where I've seen the advantages work with having the waterfall requirements and agile build. So with that, this session will not have updates, but if you do want to take a look at that paper, like I said, you can go to mydevconsession.com and download the paper to read more about these constraints and this hybrid approach. So thank you for coming, and I'll open it up for questions. There's 2 microphones in the middle. I hear the sound of, I can't wait to apply Agile. That's what I hear right now. It's an aura. Yes.
I'll ask a question because I felt bad that nobody was asking questions. I actually missed the entire session. I was downstairs. I just got here 2 minutes ago.
Okay.
So can you just give me a quick recap of... or failing that, did you talk at all about project management tools? And if you did, I won't.
I did not dive into the tools.
Okay. Do you have any tools that you recommend?
Yes. The projects that I've run Agile with, we love using Jira because you can formulate multiple sprints at one time. So you can take your bigger project, formulate what modules you want, categorize them into different sprints, launch your sprint, On each sprint, you can have a description of what you're trying to accomplish during that sprint, and you can set up a lot of controls. So you can add documentation to it, you can add testing to it, and things like that. So that seems to work well. I've seen people who don't want to quite use Jira, they've used Trello, which is a little bit, I think Jira
complete
now
opposite
knows,
end of things, really.
Yeah.
Because Jira seems so complicated. Like you need a Jira manager, basically, Jira administrator, pretty much.
you do need somebody that's running it.
Yeah. So, okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Do you use the terms Agile and Waterfall with the client? Like, do you say, we're going to do this, now we're entering the Agile phase?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it depends who the client is. I've seen clients who don't really understand software build, and so they don't really understand when you say the words Agile and Sprint. And so instead, it's explaining to them what you're doing instead of using those words. So I'll address it with, this project is going to be run in modules of 2-week iterations where we're going to work on a 2-week chunk of material, build it, and at the end we're going to do some testing, and I'm going to deliver to you the product. So I don't actually use those words. There's other clients that we have where we've got more of a partnership relationship with them, and so they understand Agile. They dictated they wanted it to be Agile, so we use all of those terms with them. So it depends. I would take a pulse on how it's going with your client interaction and determine kind of how to explain it to them. Yes.
So I'm the only IT guy, the only support where I work.
Okay.
Would you say don't even try Agile? Do a hybrid? I mean, what would be your recommendation to me?
Oh, I would.
I love the concept of Agile.
Yeah.
And being able to do the sprints, but I'm the only guy.
Right. Well, I would recommend doing it. I would recommend the hybrid approach where you're gathering your requirements first because you need to understand where you're headed. But yes, I'd absolutely recommend the Agile approach because it's helpful to understand where you're going, and it's helpful to even take advantage of the idea of breaking a project into smaller chunks and delivering on that. Because sometimes it can be hard to see down the road of how we're going to do this big full project, but even using just that modular approach of saying deliver the MVP and then add on to it is a great place to start. And I would absolutely say try it because Agile in its essence means that you're going to continue iterating and you're going to be flexible and you're going to change. So even if the shell of exactly all the things that we talked about today with sprints and different things like that don't work right away for you, you can change and adapt and kind of make your own hybrid approach. So of course, I would encourage you to figure out how Agile will work for you and take advantage of some of the techniques. Sure.
Can you talk a little bit more about how you handle testing? It sounds like you're doing testing outside of the 2-week sprint. So if you find bugs in the testing, do you then roll those back into a future sprint, or how do you handle that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll give the example of Jira like we were talking about. What can be done is as the developers are developing, they need to test exactly what they're developing. So you can put into controls like having them test and then provide either screenshots or a demo of what they've built and add it to the card about what they've built. And then as you go, at least the development has been tested as you go. But then when you deliver that to the client, in your next sprint, you can move into testing of what you've delivered to that client while you continue to build that next module, because in theory, you can be building that one module while testing and applying changes to that other module. That's the idea of iterating on different modules in parallel. Of course, that can change however it's needed for your team, but that is how I would recommend. One more question, it looks like.
The hybrid approach you're talking about, so you're using the waterfall method for your requirements phase and then an agile method for the rest of it, but they seem at odds in the sense that the waterfall method is going to deliver a fairly rigid requirement, but one of the benefits of agile is the circular process can go back and change that.
Right.
So you've got a rigid requirement delivery, then you're following that up with a process that could change that requirement.
Right, that's true. You would have changing requirements as you go, and that is the part about how important it is to have change control as well. So yes, things can change while you're in that development, and you want to be able to change quickly, but you also have to make sure that you're communicating that change well with the clients, that you still are having that good relationship that you're building. So yes, that is a good point. Okay, with that, I will end it. If you have additional questions, I'll be available after.